Something rare happened inside a regional assembly building in Samara, Russia, last month, and it deserves more attention than it received. A 69-year-old politician named Grigory Yeremayev rose before his colleagues, looked him in the eye, and said out loud what the Kremlin has spent years and enormous resources trying to suppress. Russia's war in Ukraine has failed. Its goals are now fundamentally unachievable, and Vladimir Putin knows it. His microphone was cut. He was shouted down by colleagues eager to perform loyalty to an audience that wasn't even in the room. He was subsequently fined 30,000 rubles, roughly $388, an almost comically small sum for an act of such political courage. And yet, despite all of that, the words had already escaped into the air. What makes this moment significant is not the speech itself, but what it reveals about the structural rut now spreading through Russia's political ecosystem. Dissent is no longer confined to street protesters who can be easily swept up and charged. It is now surfacing inside the institutions that Putin has spent 2 decades constructing as monuments to his own authority. That is a qualitatively different kind of problem, and one that no amount of propaganda can fully contain. To understand the weight of Yeremayev's words, one has to step back from daily casualty counts and contested village names and look at the war's strategic architecture, or rather, its ruins. Putin launched this invasion with a clear set of objectives. Ukraine was to be subdued quickly, its Western-leaning government replaced, NATO's eastern expansion halted, and Russia's dominance over what the Kremlin calls its near abroad reasserted. None of these goals have been achieved. More striking still, the war has produced outcomes that are almost a perfect inversion of Putin's intentions. Finland and Sweden, 2 nations that had maintained studied neutrality for decades, are now NATO members. European defense spending, long the source of American frustration and Russian comfort, is rising sharply. Ukraine, which Putin sought to absorb into a reconstructed Russian sphere, has become more deeply integrated into European institutions and identity than at any point in its post-Soviet history. Finnish President Alexander Stubb captured this collapse of strategic vision with unusual directness at the Munich Security Conference in February, ticking off failure after failure with the measured calm of someone reading from a completed autopsy report. This is not the picture of a war that is going badly. It is a picture of a war that has already, at the strategic level, been lost. Russian state media has long leaned on the memory of the Great Patriotic War, the Soviet Union's devastating but ultimately triumphant struggle against Nazi Germany, as a cultural foundation for public support to the Ukraine campaign. The comparison was always ideologically convenient. It is now becoming factually damaging. January 2026 marked the point at which Russia's special military operation officially exceeded the length of the Soviet Union's entire involvement in World War II. That alone is a damning benchmark. But the deeper problem is what Russia has to show for that time. By the end of World War II, Soviet forces had driven the Wehrmacht between 1,500 and 1,800 kilometers westward, all the way to Berlin. In Ukraine, after more than 4 years of fighting, Russian forces have managed to penetrate approximately 150 kilometers at their deepest points, roughly a tenth of the distance, against an adversary whose entire military budget is a fraction of what the Soviet Union faced. Meanwhile, Ukrainian drones now regularly strike targets more than 1,500 kilometers inside Russian territory. The psychological and strategic implications of that reality, that the aggressor nation is absorbing strikes deep within its own borders, well into what should be the safe interior, cannot be overstated. The Soviets were not facing equivalent pressure on their home soil by the time they had been fighting for this long. Putin is. What Yeremayev articulated, and what analysts have been increasingly noting, is that Putin now finds himself in a strategic trap of his own construction. He cannot win. The military and economic math simply does not support the kind of total victory that would justify the cost already paid. But he also cannot stop, because any negotiated settlement that falls short of his original objectives will be read correctly as defeat. And defeat, for a leader who has built his entire political identity around projecting strength and historical inevitability, is not merely a policy failure. It is an existential threat to his rule. This dynamic helps explain the glacial pace of any meaningful peace diplomacy. Russia entered negotiations hoping that American pressure would compel Ukraine to cede the Donbass, a territorial concession that would at least give Putin something tangible to present domestically. That calculation has not played out. Ukraine has not been pressured into surrender, and Russia finds itself continuing a war it cannot win in order to avoid acknowledging a defeat it has already suffered. The financial dimension of this failure is often underreported, but may ultimately be the most consequential. Russia's economy, for all the resilience it demonstrated in the early months of sanctions pressure, is now showing serious long-term strain. Military spending consumes an ever-growing share of GDP, while investment in healthcare, education, infrastructure, and social welfare has contracted. The International Monetary Fund projects Russian economic growth at just 0.8% for 2026, following an even more tepid 2025. Beneath those numbers lies a demographic catastrophe unfolding in slow motion. More than 1 million casualties, killed and wounded, have been drawn disproportionately from working-age men in Russia's provinces. A country that was already facing unfavorable demographic trends is now accelerating them through a war that was supposed to bring economic rewards. Ukraine holds an estimated $15 trillion in mineral wealth. Putin wanted access to that prosperity. What he has instead purchased, at enormous human cost, is a smaller share of a resource-rich country that now despises Russia more than at any point in modern history. It is tempting to dismiss Grigory Yeremayev as an outlier, an elderly politician willing to absorb a fine and potential prosecution in exchange for a moment of conscience. But that framing misses the point. The significance of his speech is not that one man spoke out. It is that the room he spoke in, filled with men who built careers on loyalty to Putin's project, could not entirely silence him before the words were already public. The Russian state apparatus has been extraordinarily effective at managing dissent. The tools are well documented: criminal charges, asset seizures, travel bans, and in the most serious cases, imprisonment or worse. Those tools have not disappeared, but they work best against isolated individuals operating outside formal structures. When the dissent begins to emerge from within the parliament buildings themselves, when pro-war military bloggers begin to be labeled as foreign agents for accurately reporting battlefield failures, something more systemic is underway. Russia is not on the verge of revolution. That conclusion will be both premature and analytically careless. But it is on the verge of an extended period of internal contradiction, in which the gap between official narrative and lived reality becomes increasingly impossible to paper over. Yeremayev's shouted-down speech is not the beginning of that process. It is evidence that the process is already well advanced.